morning, everybody. This is a historic tech talk. It's number 10 in our series, and I'm really excited to welcome back Mike Amundsen. He's going to talk, well, we're going to talk, and him are going to talk Hypermedia APIs, and I'm going to mediate. Just off the top, I just wanted to, while people are getting connected, plugged in, logged in, don't forget there's 3 ways to ask your questions. You can go right through the stream on live stream. You can go through Facebook, click the red button up in the sort of the bottom right below the screen. It says check in and chat, and you can just simply tweet questions with hashtag Layer7Live. And I just wanted to address, we had an email from one of our viewers, and I just wanted to, if he's on the line, what was his name? Gustavo said, great tech talks. I'm just curious if you're going to be doing one around APIs for mobile applications. So I just wanted to mention that we've got a webinar coming up that's going to talk about that very thing. So it'll be August 16th, and the title is BYOD, Enterprise Mobility, Beauty and the Beast. So kind of an interesting title, and it's going to feature our VP of Client Services, Matt McClarty, and that'll be August 16th, 9 a.m. So, and maybe down the road we're going to do a tech talk. The next one that's coming up is August 7th, and it's going to talk about, we're going to talk about mobile-friendly federated identity, and Francois, our chief architect, is going to be our guest for that one. So I think at this point, I'll just turn it over to Mike. Welcome Mike Amundsen. He's our principal API architect. And
Hey.
I think he quite literally wrote the book on Hypermedia APIs. So Mike, if you would like to just sort of introduce the topic for us, and then we'll get to the questions as soon as we have some.
All right, excellent. Well, first of all, hello, Steve, and this is really exciting. This is a remote experience, and I'm really looking forward to the talk today. So we were talking earlier. Hypermedia APIs is really a sort of a style of API writing. It's a slightly different style rather than the typical remote procedure call where we mimic the way local components work together by publishing a set of functions and arguments. The hypermedia style is actually designed to take advantage of the lossy networks like HTTP work. It sends not just the data, but also information about the next possible thing that you can do. So this style goes back a long time. Hypermedia itself goes all the way back to the Manhattan Project, first written about by Vannevar Bush in the late 40s, where he saw people really kind of riffing off each other and noticed that once all of these really smart people went to various locations, they wouldn't be able to connect or link to each other the way they were while they were working on the project. He kind of wrote this idea about how links could work and how machinery could work. A guy by the name of Douglas Engelbart picked this material up and actually invented what we now know as the mouse while at Xerox PARC in order to create linkable material, hypermedia links. Ted Nelson, a surfy guy out in California, sort of came up with the idea that machines should be able to link and talk to each other. He came up with the phrase, that you can surf the web, because he was a surfing guy. He said the screens would be the surfboards of the future. And so we say surf the web because of him. And all sorts of things all lead up to this idea finally to a guy by the name of Fielding, who wrote a dissertation when he was trying to finish off his PhD program, where he mentioned this notion of hypermedia as a way to drive application information at remote locations. So Hypermedia APIs really picks up on all these pieces, this idea of using links and arguments as a way to drive things forward. So it's a different way to design APIs, and it's one that I see people starting to use more and more often, and it's really pretty exciting.
Okay, great. First question, I guess, would be why use hypermedia style instead of RPC style?
Yeah, it's a very good question, and the even better question is when, right? Because there are sometimes when an RPC style works just as well or possibly better than a hypermedia style. But the biggest factors in in selecting hypermedia as a way to do this is when you've got a situation where the interaction between server and client, the details change frequently. Like today, you might have so many inputs for an argument. Tomorrow, those inputs might change. This is especially true when you've got different workflows. Like today, the steps to completing an invoice might be 1, 2, 3, 4. Tomorrow, they might be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So if you have varying interactions, what we would call transitions between the client and server, the hypermedia pattern starts to work very, very well. The biggest advantage of using hypermedia patterns are you can introduce these kinds of changes without having to recompile and redistribute client applications every time there's a change. This is especially important if you're dealing in the mobile universe. Consider what it takes to test and then mount an app into the app stores and then distribute this to possibly thousands, tens of thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands of users. If every time you make a change to the server, you've got to go through that process again, it gets to be really prohibitive. So hypermedia can actually be a real advantage in using that style of APIs for mobile devices.
Right, okay. Another question, aren't hypermedia APIs slower since the message is usually larger?
Right, that's a good question. Usually not for a couple of reasons. If you consider the bulk of the message, a lot of times this transition material doesn't actually take up that much more than data. If you're sending a list of 100 items and a search form at the bottom, that search form makes up a very small amount of that list of 100 items. Of course, if you're sending one item in 3 search forms, right, 3 different ways that you could search, then of course you've kind of flipped the balance, right? So it's a little bit like the old XML chatty bits where the signal to noise ratio can get out of whack. So if it turns out that most of your traffic are very, very tiny messages and the amount of transitions you want to express are quite wide, well, yeah, maybe hypermedia begins to look like a larger message platform. Most of the way HTTP works, however, is through caching. So you can cache a lot of that information, and it's really not an expense at all. In fact, I've seen a couple of designs recently. People are talking about separating the hypermedia transition material into one document and the data into another document. So the transition, or what's sometimes called the interaction model, actually is almost like CSS. It's like sort of a linked document to the data. And since those links can be cached, or the results can be cached, you might actually even end up with more functionality and smaller traffic, smaller number of bits shipped around since they're cached. So it's definitely an issue to think about. Often it doesn't present a problem. When it does, there are ways around it.
Great. Can you talk a little bit about how to write a client against a hypermedia API?
Yes.
After you have a sip of your water.
Yeah, thank you. Actually, that's a really, really good question, because it does turn out that writing the client is very different for hypermedia style than for RPC style, and we don't have much help or guidance on that right now. So this is actually the biggest challenge. So writing a client for hypermedia is writing a client that accepts a message, parses the data, renders it how it might want to do, and then notices every single one of the possible transitions, and then renders those transitions either as links or forms, or maybe expandos that you might, have on a screen or something. So that's extra work, or that's different kinds of work. So instead of hard coding every possible link or rule or transition, you write a client that discovers them in the message and then renders them. So that's additional work. You can think of it, a browser is sort of a very limited form of hypermedia. Right? So it's domain agnostic. It doesn't really understand the difference between a game and an accounting app. and it just recognizes these things and renders them on the screen. So when you think about a specific application or a specific domain like accounting or user management or something, you can improve that experience quite a bit with a hypermedia client, but you still need to have that I can recognize a new transition when it appears and show it to the user. So it's definitely a new set of challenges, and there aren't a lot of applications that make that possible. So you have to kind of do it hand by hand, but it's certainly something that's worth doing. And as I say, in the last year or so, I've seen some very, very creative use of that. So the next question here, I think, is from Toto. And what's the role of Atom in a Hypermedia API?
And we have a question. Oh, sorry.
Go ahead. Go ahead. Go ahead. Do you want me to do the?
Toto asks, "What's the role of Atom in a Hypermedia API?"
Yeah, okay. We'll get this worked out. There's a little bit of timing bug, but we'll get it worked out. Yeah. So that's another really cool question. Atom is one of the after sort of like HTML. Atom was the next hypermedia message design format. So Atom is a typical item and collection format. Was born out of the RSS feeds. And it has a very, very simple hypermedia interaction model, which is basically the CRUD style, the create, read, update, delete style. So Atom makes a very nice hypermedia style. There are a couple of challenges to Atom. Atom is XML, which is kind of old school today for some folks, but there's lots of great XML libraries for parsing and recognizing things. Atom also has two things that make it a bit of a challenge for hypermedia. Atom doesn't design a search experience. So in Atom, you can't ship down a message that has the Atom search box. So you need to use an extension to do that. It turns out that OpenSearch uses the Atom model for designing its search pattern, so you can actually add extensions to Atom to do searching. Atom also doesn't have standard form inputs, so like here's how you do an add form or an update form. So there's a general rule in Atom which basically says whatever the message design is, you can make that as sort of an edit or an add. So it's a little hard to describe those things in Atom right now. I've actually seen people use the Atom body to insert an HTML form. So you would insert HTML as a namespace, HTML:form, and then you can put add forms and things inside the content body of Atom. But Atom is a good, simple list, CRUD style item, and it's a really great way to start writing hypermedia applications.
Okay. Another question. It's a bit of a long one, so I'm going to make sure that you get it here.
Cool.
So I'll just read it, and then hopefully Mike is going to read it on his end in case he needs to go over it again. So Matt asks, it's been said that APIs are analogous to what a website was for a company back in the 90s. Following that line, does it make sense to have a kind of homepage for your API that uses hypermedia in the response to guide the user?
Oh, yeah, okay. So that's pretty cool. So this is also a very common question. And in a lot of ways, APIs are analogous to sites. So the API sort of can be your product and can be the way you interact with users. You can think of a home page in an API. So that might, but I think what people often do is they think that home page for APIs might have to have every possible hypermedia link and form that there is. In other words, they use that home page the way SOAP uses WSDL or the way some people use HTTP waddle. And if you think about it that way, you're kind of missing the boat, because on our home page, we hardly ever have every link that's possible for the user to use. That would be too overwhelming. That makes it sort of unusable, right? It sort of breaks usability rules. But what you have on that home page are the things that are most likely to be starting places for a user. And that includes a search box or some other things. So that's very often a great way to start designing your hypermedia API. Think of it as a landing place, an initial place where people go that has links to products or users or companies or stores and a search box or to find your nearest location. So you can do all of that with your API the same way you would have done that with the user experience. And you can decorate the actual API itself to have meaningful bits of information that lead an application, whether it's a user-driven or a machine-driven application, directly along the path that you'd want to go. So it's a good approach, and it's one that you want to follow up on and make it just as usable, just as friendly as you would a regular homepage on a website.
Okay, another question from Toto. Should you rather have custom links like books, 1212, OT, use Atom Link, or otherwise use Atom Link?
I
is
think
one better than the other?
Yeah, no, I think I understand the question. So there are a couple of things.
Or use Atom Link. Sorry,
Yeah.
it's or.
Yeah. So typically what you want to do is you want to use something that machines can recognize. So Atom Link is easily recognizable, right? So I'm going to look for all of the Atom links so that I can render them as possible choices. The content of the link, the href in the link, whether it's book 1212 or books $1212 or books QWERTY, doesn't really matter as much as the link itself. But the sort of the added sauce, especially when you're doing hypermedia, links need an identifier. So I need to know this is an identifier for a book item, right? So very often you're going to have Atom Link, then you're going to have an href to some magical place, and then you're going to have an identifier called a rel, or a relation value. And that rel might say book, or might say book item, or might say book detail. And now that's going to be information that the application can use to say, hey, I found a book detail link that you might want to follow. Just like humans will use the text inside an aref, machines can use that rel value to know exactly what this link is about. And if you write very good rel values and you predefine them, you also have the opportunity to write machines that don't have to rely on direct human interaction, and they can look for the rel values that are important to them to follow a path through the application itself. So it turns out this link identifier becomes way, way more important than the actual value of the href. And that means that you can design your links to match whatever tooling, whatever application tools, whatever framework you're using, and it's not important for you to get too tied up in designing the link itself as much as designing that message and that rel value.
Okay, sorry, next question. Do you need a different server setup for Hypermedia APIs?
Different server setup. The short answer is no, but it's quite possible that the message sent for the API is going for a Hypermedia API will be different than the message you would send to the actual like human user, like HTML. So you might write a different. A lot of people will write API.myservice.com, right? So the API namespace is really where all of those things come from. So you don't really need. You can write Hypermedia APIs in any language using any framework because it's really a message design that's really, really important. And what you're doing is you're mapping these messages to your problem domain, whether it's event management or accounting systems or shipping or anything like that. So you don't need any special server setup, but you probably will create a different namespace for your API set, one that allows you to evolve and transform those links over time without necessarily hurting the visual application that users might use. So I don't think you need anything special on the server side.
Okay. Sorry, I think I sort of interrupted the flow of Toto's questions. He followed up with, okay, but how do you enforce? So if you go back to what he had said.
Sure. So enforcing is actually a great question. So what happens a lot of times in building a service or in building an API is we think an awful lot about enforcing rules or enforcing contracts when we build these APIs. We want to make sure that clients follow these rules explicitly and don't do the wrong thing at the wrong time, and make sure that they do things in the proper order. They order messages, or they design messages that they send back to you properly. In a hypermedia style, the enforcement actually changes. So rather than enforcing which links are used at which time, what you're really enforcing are which hypermedia affordances, which links and forms are recognized by that application. So since you're sending links with each message, you're giving the application the hint already about what's valid or what's next. So it's very easy for the application, whether it's human-driven or machine-driven, to follow those steps along. Now, just like in any real website, any human-driven experience, humans can type in whatever they want in the URL, and they might get a 404, or they might get a 403 saying forbidden, or they might get some redirection to some other place. So the server itself gets written the same way for the API experience as the human experience. So you still need to be prepared for people to do things that are unexpected or do things that are incomplete. And great usable websites for humans redirect people or give them hints as to what to do next. I'm sorry, that page is not found. Do you want to search for something else? That same experience can be done for APIs as well. So if some client crafts an invalid message and ships it to a URL, the server can respond, 404 with an affordance that allows them to search for something they're interested in, or a redirect that sends them back to some, starting point. So you have the same experiences. The enforcement switches from saying you've got to write your client in this way that does this order to you've got to write your client to recognize these things. And if you don't, I'm going to send you back to some other location. So it works out about the same, but it's done in a slightly different way.
Okay. I just want to mention that G. Hussein had a question, and it went through the scroll before I could get it. We had a few questions all at once that came in. Would you rewrite that question for us, please? G. Hussein, good friend of Tech Talks. I know you've been here before. I want to get to your question, but like I said, I just missed it because several of them came in at once, and it's down at the bottom of the scroll.
Cool.
So just rewrite that for me, please. And then same with Matt. We missed the beginning of your question. You've got a two-part question there. So if you wouldn't mind just rewriting that for me, please, I'd appreciate that. Then in the meantime, Toto's got another follow-up that he put in as Mike was answering. So I'll just read that off. It's easy in XML schema to make the element required, but XML schema won't let you specify that you need a element with a rel equals next attribute less than a minute ago. So I'm not exactly sure what the question is, but that's Toto's comment as you were giving the answer to your last question.
I'm not sure if I follow. I think this goes back to sort of the enforcement or the validation rule pattern. So very often what I see people do is if they start writing services, they might use XSD to validate incoming messages. In other words, does this match a certain message pattern? Does this have the required elements in it? And that works pretty well, but XSD is not really well designed for a kind of an interactive experience where there are a lot of dependencies and details. Some items might be valid in one case and not the other. I've actually used RelaxNG more often. Because RelaxNG is a little bit more flexible if you want to do validation. There's also another variation on XSD. The name escapes me. I used a very cool library, Schematron, which also has some very nice features for helping in some validation. But the bigger comment here is to really fall back on I forget the name of the guy who invented TCP/IP, who helped write that RFC, had a great rule, which was be very liberal in what you accept and very strict in what you produce. So the idea is if you can make the message work at all, you want to accept that message and make your best guess for people. It's really not good in a hypermedia experience or in any web experience to reject messages if too quickly, because it turns out to create a high failure rate. And if you've got a high failure rate, whether you've got a visual site or you've got an API, people are going to go somewhere else. If it turns out to be really difficult to get a message through because there are a lot of details. The other big thing to think about in terms of message enforcement is if you have this application exist for a long time, you might want to start changing some rules next year, 2 years, 3 years from now. If you write too restrictive a message today, you're going to have to create brand new message formats or brand new URLs every time you want to make a slight change. So while it's important to make sure a message isn't going to hurt the system, it's much better to be very flexible in accepting messages and not worry too much about too much schema information when you accept messages. That's kind of vague, but hopefully that helps a little bit.
Okay. Yeah, and just Toto, make sure to follow up if you have a more specific question, or maybe Mike didn't quite touch on it exactly what it was you were looking to get answered.
Yep.
But we do have another question from Matt and Hussein. We're still looking for your question back. I'm sorry, it just went by too fast and I didn't get a chance to get a handle on it. So if you could re-post that question, I'd really appreciate it. But Matt asks, REST versus SOAP was a big area of debate. Now we're seeing debate within the REST world around pure versus pragmatic REST. Is there real substance in this debate, and how does it relate to the use of hypermedia?
That's very good. So my short answer is there's no real substance. So very often what we'll see in blogs, or what you'll even see in people who speak at conferences, is they'll want to set up some kind of dichotomy, some duality. You're either with me or you're against me or something like that, right? So although this happened around the REST and SOAP period, now there seems to be this idea, well, okay, maybe we don't like SOAP, but there's good REST and bad REST, or there's pure REST and there's not so pure REST, or lazy REST, or some other kinds of names that would set up some other fancy duality to kind of make us decide something. I don't really buy into that. You'll notice, so the topic here is actually hypermedia, right? It wasn't REST. It's true that Fielding really made hypermedia very central to his particular architectural style. But you can use hypermedia without buying into other things about what Fielding would like to do or how Fielding sees architecture in distributed networks. So it's really the idea of using hypermedia. There are some people who say if you don't use hypermedia and you claim it's REST, you're lying and you're bad or something like that. It doesn't really interest me too much. What I'm really interested in is trying to figure out how to create great APIs, APIs that work for lots of different devices and that can last over time. So the investment that all my third-party clients make in my API can really pay off over a long period of time, that I don't churn them out, make those clients rewrite their apps all the time. And hypermedia really helps me do this. So that's where I really focus on that. And as for debating, how many Fieldings can fit on the head of a pin, it's not really too interesting to me. And I wouldn't get too tied up in it, whether it's, internally within your organization or externally, like talking to other folks. If what you're doing works, if you can create great APIs and it works for your client community, you're doing the right thing. It doesn't really matter what name it has to me.
Okay. Another comment from Toto. He just wanted to answer back and say, yeah, that helps. Thanks for the answer. The problem though is that some clients demand an XSD, which makes Hypermedia API a tough sale sometimes. So maybe you could just comment on that, Mike.
Yeah. If you have clients that demand something that make it harder to do hypermedia, there's really not a lot you can do about that. I mean, honestly, if that's the demand, then you're going to have to figure out some other solution for those folks. Maybe they don't want that kind of hypermedia experience. I find usually, however, what my clients, when I talk to folks, what they want is assurances that this is going to be safe, that this is going to be valid, and that this is going to be scalable. And a particular technology, whether it's JSON or XML or XSD or RelaxNG, or Bacchus form or whatever it is, usually is not the critical piece that makes this a usable, scalable, evolvable app. There's lots of possibilities. So if you're stuck, if there's some other demands that make a particular thing required, yeah, you may end up having a harder time. But if you're looking for long-term usability and evolvability and scalability, usually you can interchange those pieces very well. And you have to just take it on a case-by-case basis.
And so it's becoming a little bit of a dialogue between Mike and Toto. Okay, but how do you enforce the presence of it in your schema?
Well,
or use Atom links.
Yeah, there are a lot of possibilities. I think probably we can talk all day about a particular implementation detail. It's pretty easy to know whether or not a link is there. You don't even need an XSD to do that, right? It's pretty easy to know whether or not an item is missing. You don't need XSD to do that. I think one of the other things that this is probably a good time to bring this up, and this may or may not be in Toto's mind. Very often I see individuals crafting APIs that are object serializers. Like I've got an object on the server, and what I want to do is serialize that into JSON or XML and ship that over to the client, where the client can kind of reconstitute that into some other object or object graph. It turns out Hypermedia doesn't really support that very well. And in fact, object transfer is kind of an anti-pattern in highly scalable, evolvable distributed apps. Because what it really requires me to do is it requires both client and server to agree on an object model. And if you think about this, if I set up a server this year and 2 years from now, somebody else comes along, wants to write a client for it, do they have to actually find out what my object model was 2 years ago in order to run the app? It'd be a whole lot better if they didn't have to worry about object models at all. Turns out they're using one language, using Dart or something like that. I'm using Ruby, or I'm using some other C# or Java or something. They shouldn't really have to share all those details. So a lot of this XSD or enforcement has a lot to do with making sure that objects are, like, there's high fidelity between server and client and objects. And the APIs that I design are focused totally on the transfer of state of the application within the message itself. So it's not, I'm going to transfer an object within a message. I'm going to transfer the interesting state of the application within a message. And when you switch to state transfer rather than object transfer, a lot of this validation of members in a message gets a lot simpler. And then you don't need XSD or other kind of more high-end validators in order to do that kind of work. I don't know if that's exactly what Toto was thinking about, but that's been my experience.
Okay, perfect. Toto, I hope you're satisfied. It sounds like you have lots and lots of questions, but we're going to get to Hussein's question now. He's been waiting patiently, and he just simply wants to know, what are other accepted community standards for Hypermedia APIs other than Atom?
Very, very good. Recently, like within the last 18 months or so, almost 2 years, there have been some additional authoring of registered hypermedia types. There's two I'm going to mention. First one I'm going to mention is called Hypertext Application Language, or HAL. was created by Mike Kelly, who's very, very, very smart guy, and he's registered with the IANA, this media type, and actually has both a JSON and an XML variant. And HAL is a very lightweight a link pattern protocol, similar in many ways to Atom. The only hypermedia affordance it has is links, and documentation can be used to explain what this link rel means and how to interact with it. And I know that that's actually being used in a handful of locations. I think there's more than a dozen implementations on client or server for processing HAL. If you look hypertext application language, just Google that, you'll find some information on that. I'll mention another one, which is a design that I registered about 2 years ago, and it was part of the book that I wrote. It's called Collection JSON. So again, it also it's similar to HAL, and it's a collection model, but it has affordances for query templates and editing templates in it. So this is another hypermedia type that's registered with the IANA. And these are just two that I know of off the bat. I experimented, and I know some other people are using a pattern that actually uses XHTML as a way to do hypermedia. It has some limitations, but one of the advantages that one has is you can actually test it in a browser. It actually creates forms and links, so you can test it as you're going along. It makes a great test bed. I've also seen in the last couple of months a handful of other people doing their own private message designs that they have not yet registered. So we might see more in the future. But if you take a look at those two, Collection JSON and HAL, they both show similarities in design detail, and that can give you some ideas on creating your own community standards. Now, the cool thing about the way the web works, and I'm gonna channel Tim Berners-Lee at the last World Wide Web conference this year, is somebody was saying they didn't really like the way video's working on the internet, and there were a series of things. And finally, Tim Berners-Lee said, look, if you see something that's not right, he said, geek out, make it and publish it, and people will start to use it. And this is exactly the way these message designs work as well. You know, Atom was organic. It came out of the RSS experience that was actually started by one person, Dave Weiner. HAL and Collection JSON are also very organic. They came out of what people were thinking needed to be done. So as we do more of this, it's actually very easy to get started on a design, and registering with the IANA, which is the official place to register message designs. There are hundreds of designs registered there. Registering there is not difficult at all. So as you start to build these up, register them, share them, we're going to get a much richer set of information, a much richer set of media types, and we'll start to coalesce around the ones that are effective. And I think we could have some really exciting things happen in the next year or so.
Great. And we've got a Twitter question from Javier Cervantes.
Okay.
So we're going all over the world again. This
Excellent.
is Guadalajara. I see Vancouver, we've got US, we've got England. But his question is, oh, sorry, wrong one, Mike.
That's
His
fine, don't
question
worry.
is, in data-driven apps, would you recommend using Hypermedia?
Okay. So in data-driven apps, my short answer would be yes, but there got a couple of things to think about. So one of the things we've got is this push towards big data, right? There's lots and lots of data out there. There's lots of things we can do with this data. One of the struggles I have when I start to consume big data is I get a bunch of data, but I don't know what I can do. Can I query this? And can I query all of it? Can I query some of it? Can I sort by all the locations? Can I sort by only some of the locations? Will the query and sort rules this year be the same 3 years from now? So there's, even when you've got, a data focus, you may still need to provide some hypermedia to afford people to do things. So you might want to explain, and this goes back to that notion of possibly having a secondary hypermedia document that explains how to use the data. So you may still, even when you're delivering large amounts of data, want to give clients, give applications give application builders hints on how they can create interactions. So I would say yes to start. I know right now there's a big push towards a pattern called RDF, which is very data centric and very data focused. And RDF doesn't yet have a good interaction model or hypermedia affordance model. I saw a paper that was delivered at a conference earlier this year that is attempting to bring hypermedia to RDF. He was a Scandinavian gentleman whose name escapes me. If somebody wants, they can send a tweet or a message to you, and I'll post the answer. So there's some approach to do this very same thing as well. So even in large, sort of big data styles, the idea of still including some kind of hypermedia that affords searching and sorting and filtering so people know what to do is really a good idea. And you can do it in this sort of a sideband way, the way CSS is done, and still be very effective. In fact, I even toyed with, well, I haven't shared this with anybody, but I toyed with actually writing hypermedia affordances or links and forms for CSV data. It's actually kind of curious. I don't know that it's, nobody's ever going to use it, but just to kind of prove that it might be possible. So I would still, even in a big data case, I would consider using some hypermedia to afford people to know exactly what they can filter and sort.
Okay, a couple more questions. Here's a simple one, and I think I might know the answer to this. Any suggestions? Toto asks again. Any suggestions for a reading list on Hypermedia APIs? I know you referenced or talked about a couple references, but maybe there's some books out there people might want to read on Hypermedia APIs.
Yeah, so I guess the first one I guess I would recommend would be the book I completed for O'Reilly last year, which is Building Hypermedia APIs with HTML5 and Node. So it's not too long. It's about a little over 200 pages, and it has 3 servers and 6 clients, and it goes through various steps. So that's one possibility. There's a guy by the name of Steve Klabnik, and I think that's actually his Twitter handle. It's at Steve Klabnik, Klabnik, I think. It might be CK. Sorry. But Steve is working on an online book that's about designing hypermedia APIs. So I would definitely recommend checking that out. And I think you can actually, it's a subscription service, but I think you might be able to get the first chapter free or something. Steve might be mad at me when I say that. But Steve's working on a very interesting project as well. Backing up a little further, there are a couple of other books that I would highly recommend. There's a book called Rest in Practice. There's by 3 authors, Jim Weber, Ian Robinson, and Savas Parastadidis. I'm pretty sure it's Greek. I'm pretty sure I got his last name correct. Rest in Practice. And this is actually a little bit more of an enterprisey book. Talks about how hypermedia works and how to design a hypermedia application. It's a very, very good book. Before that, moving a little bit away from hypermedia and more towards a RESTful style or a high fidelity HTTP style, Subbu Alamaraju has a great book called The RESTful Web Services Cookbook. So I highly recommend that book because that book is very good for getting a good sense of how to use HTTP to interact between client and server. It's got some very good material in there. And then finally, the classic book, the book that really started it, was released in 2007 by Leonard Richardson and Sam Ruby, and it's called RESTful Web Services, and it's really an introductory book. Leonard Richardson invented a thing called the Richardson Maturity Model, which says he sort of has this scale of how hyper or how RESTful your API is. There are a lot of things in that book now, and it's only 5 years old, but that are a little bit dated. But it's a great starting point, a great jumping off point. And I do think that Leonard is actually going to start on a second edition of that book. So I think those are some really, really good books that I would recommend. There may be more out there that other people want to share. I'd love to hear about what it is you guys are reading and what you think is helpful too.
Great. Okay, and it looks like we've got one more question.
Okay.
So if you have any more questions, we're sort of running down. getting towards the end. Mike's been on the hot seat for a while now, and Toto's been grilling him good. And he's got a final question that says, if your API is 100% about serving data, for example, no application state transfer, is Hypermedia API still the best choice? And you may have kind of addressed that, so maybe you can just comment on that. And
Well, yeah,
there's one or two last questions and try to squeak them in. Otherwise, you can email us questions at any time at techtalk at layer7tech.com, sorry. Techtalk at layer7tech.com. And you can email your questions in at any time, and we'll try to answer them on the next Tech Talk.
sure.
But Mike, if you could just maybe address that last question about if your API is 100% about serving data, is Hypermedia still the best choice?
Yeah, so actually it's really good because one of the things that Toto brought up is the idea of no application state transfer. There are lots of cases where the applications we build don't need to send data back to the server. In other words, they're not going to send a search string. They're not going to send any inputs that get written. So in this case, if all you're doing is serving data itself, the only kind of hypermedia affordance you might need is a link to other data. In other words, you might have a block of data, and you may want to say, if you click here, you can get details about this data. Or you might have a block, sort of a list of items, and you might want to say, if you click here, you get another list of related items. So even in the case where you're not actually transferring changing state to the server, you still probably want to use a link or a set of links in order to allow somebody to follow additional data. So there's still a possibility that hypermedia can come in handy. There are lots of examples of read-only hypermedia. And the advantage of that is you get to change those links over time. So 5 years from now, if I still want to serve this data, but it get moved to a new server, or I split it up, then I can go ahead and use the exact same interaction message that I was using 5 years ago when it was on another server, and clients are still going to work just fine. They haven't memorized all these URIs or memorized some pattern. I've got freedom to change that over time. So even in read-only, it could turn out that hypermedia still gives you a lot of freedom that lasts a long time.
Okay. Well, I hope that answers all the questions. I'm just going to say thanks so much, Mike, for being with us today. That was really interesting, and thanks for all the questions to the people in the audience. And like I said, you might be interested in, we've got a webinar, more of a formal kind of webinar that you can register for, which is going to be August 16th, and it's BYOD Enterprise Mobility. Beauty and the Beast is the title, and it's at 9 a.m. on PDT August 16th. And then the next Tech Talk will be August 7th, 9 a.m. And we're going to be talking mobile-friendly federated identity with Francois, our chief architect. So thanks again very much. This was a great kind of experience. It was the first one we did remotely, and it was a little bit awkward in a couple of moments. I think we got a little delay action. But it was good, and just thanks very much, Mike, and thanks to everybody for joining us. We really appreciate the questions, and it's been really good. So thanks very much. See you next time.
See you.